I think we have enough quorum, so let me begin. I think we're already 15 minutes late, and we're going to close this session by 1:15. So welcome to the session on cyberspace norms. As we all know, we've already touched on many of the themes that we're going to discuss in this panel. Now, the idea of norms, international norms, as shared expectations of state behavior and probably extending to other non-state entities as well. Now, it's quite clear that given the expanding weight of the cyberspace sector on our economy, on our security, interstate security, as well as internal security, there is a growing demand for norms in the cyberspace. I mean, covering a whole range of areas of interstate relations, privacy, cybercrime, you name it. I mean, I think you have the full range of issues. There is demand for greater cyber norms. But at the same time, I think getting those norms done or agreed by states has been difficult. It's not been easy. There have been serious contestations on where and how these norms ought to be negotiated. So in terms of even structure of negotiations, there is a problem. Second, I think there are different ideas about the relationship between state and citizen, different notions of privacy, and then the geopolitics, of course, affects the nature of the relationship between states. So we are in this situation where the demand is growing, but the supply has not been keeping up pace. Now, if you take a positive view of the potential for norms, that all the previous domains that had opened up, for example, with the beginning with the maritime domain, then you have the airspace, and later the outer space. Many of these areas we've seen incrementally the international system adapt and come up with specific rules of behavior for both governments in particular. So if you're an optimist, of course, you would say, look, something similar would happen eventually, provided we get our political act together. But there's also the other, I mean, if you want to be more pessimistic, the experience of the arms control where geopolitics and interstate relations is involved, we've seen it's easier to draft arms control or confidence-building measures when you least need them, and it's most difficult to actually work out specific agreements, consequential agreements, when you have where you actually need them. So that paradox, I think, to some extent will remain, I think, in the interstate domain. And then we have the whole question, is it going to come out of multilateral process? History tells us, look, a lot of agreements have been done in the multilateral process, even in the difficult areas like nuclear proliferation, other areas. But we've also seen the nature of the relationship between the major powers. That is, the big boys, what they agree between themselves often shapes and sets the environment for others to follow, or to have no choice but to adapt to the broader norms that are laid down by the big powers. So all these issues, I think, are going to be with us. And here, the classic arguments, I think, between East versus West or North versus South, I mean, do not necessarily hold. For example, on the privacy issue, there are clear differences between the Americans and the Europeans. There is a separate track of negotiations between China and the US. In some ways, China becoming a dominant player in this, much like Soviet Russia was in the nuclear domain. And so therefore, the role and the structure, I mean, of the traditional divides that we've been used to might not necessarily apply in drafting cyber norms. So I have 4 very good panelists, and I think some of them you've already met. They're going to talk about all these issues, and I'm going to ask all of them to speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, and after that, we're going to open it up for the discussion across the table, and we will try and wrap it up at 1:15. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. I mean, to my right is James Lewis. Those of you who are here on the pre-conference dinner that you've already heard him, and is quite well known as a writer on these cyberspace issues. Next to him is Ambassador Alok Prasad, who was a former Deputy National Security Advisor. He served as an ambassador in Japan, in Singapore, and was actively involved on the US desk for many years, and has also served in Washington. To my left is Patrick Pollock from the European Institute of Strategic Studies. And next to him is Joris Locke from the Global Governance Program, the Hague Institute of Justice. So I'm going to start with James, 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll go in the list that's been ordered.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting that. I'm going to give you a really quick history of how we got to pursuing norms. In 1998, the Russians proposed an arms control treaty that would have limited cyber weapons and the military use of cyberspace. And I think they did this largely out of fear of U.S. developments, but in any case, the treaty was certainly premature, and many of us began to think at this point, if the treaty doesn't work, what is the alternative? And the alternative, drawing on the experience in non-proliferation and in things like the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement, which was involved confidence-building measures, the alternative to a treaty, which is not possible still, was to create norms for state behavior and confidence-building measures to strengthen those norms. Eventually, norms perhaps could lead to some sort of formal agreement. That remains as far away as it was a decade ago. In 2012, the second group of government experts at the UN managed to reach agreement. The first one wrote a long academic report that was rejected by almost everyone involved. The second one started with a different concept after a huge debate, and that is, what's the minimum we can get away with? And they agreed to 4 lines essentially, which included lines that said the international community working through the UN should develop norms and confidence-building measures. That was picked up in the next GGE, the third one in 2013, where you had a remarkable success, due in good measure to the Australian chair, where you had the group, the Chinese very reluctant. They only did it because their president was having a summit with President Obama the next day and didn't want to be in the position of having to be the only country objecting to agreement. So it was like holding their nose in a pliers. They really looked pained. But the GGE agreed that the UN Charter applies to cyberspace, that national sovereignty applies to cyberspace, that international law applies to cyberspace, that states' commitments to human rights apply to cyberspace. Sharif was there. Sharif was one of the experts. Wave, Sharif, so they all know you're here. He was the Egyptian expert. And states endorsed the principle of state responsibility. There was a little bit of confusion because the text in a final concession to win Chinese agreement took out an explicit reference to the laws of armed conflict. But the Chinese said orally in front of the entire room that yes, they understood that international law included the laws of armed conflict. And I think they've now more formally endorsed that. So the 2013 GGE was in some ways a watershed in developing a path forward for norms based on the UN Charter, state sovereignty. It also endorsed confidence-building measures to support those norms, but at a regional level, not some huge UN entity, right? And so now where are we in 2014? And the concept of norms has been largely accepted, as you've heard, because it's been said almost as many times as multi-stakeholder at this conference. But where are we? And I think there's a couple issues that we need to think about. People are beginning to put forward very specific norms, that there'll be a neutral zone in cyberspace. And the alternative, of course, would be more general principles about stability, state responsibility. This is a political issue, it's a strategic issue, and it's unresolved. Do we go for very specific norms? On alternate Wednesdays, we agree not to attack nuclear power plants, or do we go for general principles? States will not do something that destabilizes the internet. To be determined. The second issue is there's a conflict in some way between some of the proposed norms and international law. Contrary to popular belief, international law does not forbid attacking certain targets, any target, if there's overriding military necessity, right? And so if you have a proposal that says we all agree never to attack this target, that's contrary to the current international law. By the way, as someone who's been in a little war or two, I'd say it's also contrary to practice. I mean, I don't want to see another Kellogg-Briand treaty, But these are the issues before us as we try and develop norms. And you had a good presentation from the former Netherlands foreign minister on what they might try and do in The Hague. You have another GGE, and we have a couple, I think, of the experts in the room. Not in the room, but at least in the session. We have now come to a place where the world agrees norms are the way to go because a treaty is too hard. And they've put those norms in the context of the UN system and state sovereignty. But now making them more explicit and more precise is the task before us, and it will be a difficult one. Your turn.
Thank you. Thanks, Raja. Raja, I'll touch both a little bit about governance and also on the issue of norms, because both relate to rules in cyberspace, which is largely what we're talking about. And I want to make 2 or 3 points. I think starting off from what we heard from the minister yesterday on the very ambitious vision for digital India. I mean, clearly India and a whole lot of other developing countries look on cyberspace and the internet as a tool of empowerment, as a tool to improve governance, to carry out financial inclusion, improve delivery of services. So, I mean, immediately a whole range of public policy issues arise from that. Plus, governments are then expected to provide the information infrastructure, to extend the information infrastructure. We are hoping to bring on another 600 million people online, and a responsibility to then protect that information infrastructure. So the point that I'm making is that governments necessarily are going to be involved in a much more direct way than perhaps they have been so far with the internet, and that goes for most of the developing countries. Also, the second point I want to make is that I don't think this necessarily detracts from the multi-stakeholder model, which I think most of us support and welcome because it has worked extremely well. But I don't think that we should also look at, multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism as absolutely stark, mutually exclusive processes. If you start unbundling what is really involved in the internet, into its policy components, its technical components, into its creative and innovative components, the content part of it, I think you can already start deconstructing, see that which stakeholders would need to play a more prominent role. And whether it's on some new organization which is set up for this purpose or a sort of modified existing organization, I think that's the way that one can start looking at it and dealing with this more unbundled view of the internet. I also want to say that there is room for a certain degree of creative thinking here. That we have. I mean, although the internet is so new and so innovative and so fascinating, but the policy issues it raises or the issues for society that it raises are not entirely sui generis. I mean, we have dealt with these sorts of issues. We have found the mechanisms of dealing with it. I mean, let me give you 1 or 2 examples. Look at financial flows, for example. Heavily regulated by the central banks, and everybody wants it to be that way. And yet you have these millions of transactions taking place all over the world, very much like the internet. So, I mean, it is possible to construct that system where, whether it's government, central banks, some other organization, lays down the clear rules of the game, which actually promote the commerce then to take place. Let's look at WTO. I mean, after all, who do trade negotiations eventually benefit? They benefit the producers and consumers of that country. But we leave it to the governments to negotiate trade agreements, to lay down the multilateral rules which will then enable those producers and consumers to interact with each other. If you look at institutions, I mean, you have, somebody mentioned the example of the ICRC, where the governments negotiated the broad framework, and then the various Red Cross societies, they interact and they draw up their programs. You have a more mixed system in ICAO, where the private sector, as represented by the airlines, sits together with the governments and deals with issues relating to international air traffic. So the point that I'm making is that there are these examples that we can draw upon, and there are these examples that we can use to then develop a multi-stakeholder model which gives the appropriate role to all stakeholders in areas where they have particular competence and expertise. I think coming to this issue of the norms, which really deal with state behavior, it's actually, in my view, a very good starting point, as you mentioned, that at least if you have agreed that the laws which apply to the physical world, international law, also applies to cyberspace, I think it's a very important step forward. And that self-regulating rules which states adopt for themselves will eventually come to be norms. And I think we should stay with that, let that system grow and develop, focus on the international cooperation, the responsibility of states to cooperate also in cases of cybercrime, etc. And I think that will, by itself, that process will probably lead to a more formal agreement on what should constitute norms in cyberspace.
Thanks a lot. Patrick?
Okay, I'll try to be quick for the sake of time. Let me start by thanking ORF and the Hague Institute for their very kind invitation to this event. I must start by a small disclaimer that I'm actually not an expert on norms, so it will be quite interesting exercise for me and hopefully for you. I work primarily on capacity building in cyberspace, and I think where the advantage of that might lie is that actually norms is something that really underlines our discussions and our efforts, but is not really very present explicitly. So we have norms as guiding our efforts there, but try to really operationalize them and think about how we actually translate them into concrete actions rather than talk in purely theoretical terms. Yesterday we had a session on rethinking global cyber market, and actually thinking about the title for this session, I thought that it should be rather rethinking global norms market, because actually what we're really talking about is not one norm, it's really the market of norms that we're trying to grapple with. And let me start by saying, maybe a bit against what Jim said, is that I don't really believe we need, or we don't always need a specific set of rules for cyber. I actually think that new norms or cyber norms are impossible to create or kind of emerge if we don't really have the trust in the system that's already out there. That is, there will be no trust in the system or the norms in cyberspace if we cannot really demonstrate that the existing norms are not respected and there is no commitment to them. So let me start by making my main point and kind of a conclusion to my presentation is that what we really often talk about is not new set of rules or norms in cyberspace, but rather we should focus on enforcing the existing concepts of the rule of law, good governance, and human rights. And I think the examples that I'm going to use in my presentation will give you a better idea what I'm talking about. So how do we really get there? And there I think Aristotle provides a very good quote to start with, give me a place to stand and I will move the earth. And I think one of the problems with cyberspace is that it's so complex and there are so many uncertainties that whenever we're confronted with it, we actually don't even know where to start. So we need to find this point of stability that would actually provide certain point of departure for further analysis. Technology is complicated as it is, so obscuring it further with complex and kind of abstract terms doesn't really help. Rather than talking about cyber norms in abstract terms, we should then focus the debate on how the cyber domain fits within the existing frameworks. So here I not only talk about the international law or humanitarian law that was mentioned, but really about the whole set of norms in specific areas. So how do activities in the digital context alter the application of the frameworks we already know and use? And I was quite inspired by the discussions that took place yesterday in the session on cyberterrorism. Because actually what I've realized is that there was no discussion about cyberterrorism at all. And this panel was about everything else but cyberterrorism. And I think that really demonstrated what the real challenges are. First, it's really the problem of defining the issues. As I said, the discussion wasn't really about cyberterrorism. At the first glance, it was about the link between the cybercrime and the terrorism at the best. But then if you really start digging and analyze what the discussion was about, it was rather about the link between the freedom of expression online and its limits, the protection of privacy, coordination of activities across jurisdictions, or the rule of law. And all those are familiar concepts, something that we've been worked with for decades and know how to actually navigate. So this is the language that we know and could use to address some of those big challenges. Now, there was also the problem with the solution. So we had the whole presentation about using social media. And one of the solutions proposed was that we need to train law enforcement agents to use social media in order to interact with the public. Well, but no such effort will really take place if the citizens do not really trust authorities. Nobody is going to communicate with you with social media if they don't really believe that you're going to be the authority that's really going to protect their interests and take care of them. If they see the abuses and abuses of power by law enforcement agents on a daily basis and a judicial system that doesn't work, why should Twitter change that? What's different in using social media that will kind of immediately change their approach? And I think the very good example comes really from, so basically focusing on the promotion of the rule of law is one of the keys that should be incorporated in those debates rather than talking about abstract terms. And I think one very good example comes from the exercise that the international community has had with the terrorism radicalization. And the UK has implemented very interesting projects. They've realized very fast that none of the efforts that they're undertaking are going to bring the results if they don't work with local communities. And they knew very well that they're not going to work with local communities, or nobody's going to talk to them if they do not really manage to build the trust with people on the ground. So they've really engaged with a lot of outreach activities and tried to demonstrate that actually they can lead by example and that the communities can rely on their behavior in their real life and in other spheres other than cybersecurity in this concrete case, if you want, or terrorism there. And all these are really the issues that have been in the public sphere and the policy debates for decades. So we do not really need to reinvent the wheel. We just have to look for similarities and make existing systems stronger. And let me give you another example of how trust in the system can actually bring solutions. Yesterday, a few of the speakers have also mentioned that the system of mutual legal assistance and extraditions is very slow, and it's very difficult to implement in cyberspace. Well, in the European context, we have actually managed to resolve that problem, not in the context of cyberterrorism or cyberspace specifically, but more general in the cooperation between legal authorities and law enforcement agencies, and that exactly derives from the growing trust between the member states. So as you know, we have 28 member states currently, and all of them have signed up to what is called the European Arrest Warrant. So European Arrest Warrant, it's not a typical extradition treaty or mutual legal assistance. That basically implies that if one of the member states issues a warrant for a person or convicts one of such an individual, the other party, the other member state, is automatically obliged to either to basically transfer the person to the country that requests or issues the arrest warrant. And I think this is a very interesting solution in showing you how, based on trust and that actually stems from the years of cooperation on specific issues, you can actually advance thinking in other policy areas. Now, the alternative to that is, of course, the unilateral action. And we have seen the examples of that in the US policy after 9/11, all the NSA programs. So I think that maybe rather than talking about new norms for cyberspace, we should really do our homework and see what we already have, in what ways digital context changes and alters the application, see if this can be fixed and how, and if not, only then start to rethink the whole system. Now, there is another concrete example, or so rather we should look for concrete projects. And actually this morning, Mr. Rosenthal mentioned the zone of limits as one of the alternatives. And I was thinking about cyber-specific context, but from the opposite end, could we imagine the situation that we actually cut off a specific area of a country based on UN sanctions or another type of sanctions implemented by the international community? And of course, that poses ethical questions, similar to those that have been implemented at 9/11 in case of aircraft hijacking, where we have basically said, oh, is it ethical to shoot down the plane knowing that you have so many innocent people on the plane while they actually might be one of the terrorists there? And there the solutions were different. In India, the reply was yes, actually, and the law has been put in practice. But in Germany, the initial law has been actually struck down by the Constitutional Court, saying that actually this would be state-sponsored murder. So nothing like that could be implemented. And that brings me to my last point. So basically, how do norms become dominant in the market? I said there are two different alternatives, at least in the case of the cutoffs and any others. I think there are really simply no better or worse norms out there. It's simply the mechanisms that are being used to carry this change, and I think that the capacity building is one of those mechanisms. I think while the process is indeed to improve security of other countries, whether from self-interest or a higher cost, there's also a normative element that cannot be neglected. So in that sense, capacity building becomes a kind of foreign policy tool. And the Budapest Convention, which I think Joris is going to talk about, is a very good example of that. Because as you know, the Council of Europe and the European Union providing the funding to capacity building assist third countries in building up their cyber capacities. But that is done on the condition that those countries subscribe to the either to the provisions of the Budapest Convention or make the commitment. And the reason for that is really that we want to make sure that in implementing cybersecurity laws and institutions, there is also the commitment to the rule of law and human rights. And currently 55 countries have subscribed to that. So I think that the solution, and my final thought, is really to mainstream cyber into other areas and look for solutions there, rather than try to come up with some virtual and very abstract top-down approach on cyber norms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. Thanks to OR for having me on this panel at something which has been a great conference so far. I entitled my presentation here as Finding a Cure for Pactophobia. Historians have come up with a nice term for specific times in history when there's a frenzy in international treaty making, and they call this Pactomania. It does happen once in a while. However, in cyber governance, the opposite seems to be rather the case. There seems to be a reluctance regarding the conclusion of international treaties. I think it was a bit present in this panel. I think maybe with the exception of Dr. Rosenthal, it's also here present at the conference. You definitely see it in the Twitter feed as well. It's like, yeah, do we really need an international treaty? Is there not another way how we can do it? Doesn't that not be a straitjacket that ties us down? Is law really capable of regulating cyberspace? Is it anathema really to this whole area? Since I come from the Hague Institute for Global Justice with a background of public international law, comparative constitutional law, norms in global governance, I would like to try to allay a bit of these fears pertaining to this pactophobia, this fear of international agreements in cyber governance. I'd like to do so in 3 quick steps. First is break down what we mean by progress. We've talked about this a lot. It came up in several panels. We need to move forward. Something needs to happen in cyber governance. What does progress in kind of normative development internationally mean? Secondly, how can we use the Budapest Convention as a good example of such progress, as a sectoral approach, rather than a comprehensive one? And then thirdly, how can we build then from these different sectoral treaties, then turn to global norms and principles that states would be willing to sign up to? And I think here we can learn actually a lot from the Indian constitutional experience. So to my first step, the idea of progress. There's 3 dimensions to it, 3 parameters for progress in global normative developments. The first is substance. So what is the content of the norms? How innovative, how forward-leaning are they really? And there we have already quite a lot of soft documents floating around. I think the Net Mundial outcome document was mentioned favorably now a couple of times. But there's also 2 other dimensions. One is who signs up to it. This is multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism. So how many countries, how many regions, how much universal acceptance can you really have? But then thirdly, and last but not least, is the format into which you put these norms. So And this is then really the question of an entire spectrum of soft law norms, or really just general declarations, multi-stakeholder outcome documents, going all the way up to, let's say, an international agreement, hard law, with institutions and procedures and enforcement mechanisms. But the emphasis I really want to put on here is it's a sliding scale. It's not an either-or choice, and I think it's often perceived as such, really. It's either you do something soft and flexible and fits with the cyber domain, or you do an international treaty which is seen as somehow old-fashioned and too constraining. And this brings me into the Budapest Convention as really the exception to the rule, where we have an internationally binding agreement in the cyber domain, but specifically targeted at something a good chunk of states could agree on, namely combating cyber crime. So it's rather a sectoral approach than a comprehensive approach, which I think is probably the way forward. And I have to say, I do, with as much agreement and admiration I have for the comments by Dr. Rosenthal today, I'm not entirely sure I buy the analogy with the law of the sea. There were already some compelling arguments made yesterday that it might not be really the same thing we're talking about. It's not the same kind of common good, common space. It's something quite different. And maybe in a way, I mean, I'm Dutch too, so I permit myself to say this, maybe it's a bit of a historical liability in a way. If you claim to have invented international law through law of the sea, if you're the home country of Hugo Grotius, a lot of problems then really start to look like Portuguese pirate ships from the 17th century. And so I don't know if that's really then the way forward. What I think is a good analogy, though, to cyber governance is also the international approach to anti-terrorism, where we had these two tracks where you could really see the comprehensive versus the sectoral approach. Comprehensive approach is still deadlocked, it's been going on for years, or is not really going anywhere, whereas the things that states could agree on, rather than a positive definition of what is terrorism, is rather specific aspects of it. So you start out with aircraft hijackings. Later on, you manage to agree protection of diplomats, hostages, maritime installations, and so forth. And then when you reiterate these processes, over time, certain patterns will emerge of what could be reflective of general principles and what would not be. Another point I'd like to make quickly about the Budapest Convention, coming back also to the theme of pactophobia, is it's a great example, I think, of the flexibility that international treaties can actually afford you. So even if you sign up to this as a legally binding document, it doesn't mean that it's a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. It really showcases all the different ways you can mold the obligations to your national preferences, for instance. So there's different options as to the substance. So it says, to give you a concrete example, with child pornography, it says, okay, every country that signs up should define it as a criminal offense. Definitely, if you produce and then disseminate through online means child pornography, so that you can't opt out of. But then how much further you go, for instance, would be possession of child pornography on what's called here a computer data storage medium. Would that be a criminal offense that you can opt out of? In addition to those codified opt-outs, you can also issue reservations to certain other provisions in the treaty, so you can adapt it a bit more. You can issue declarations with certain interpretations to make your, let's say, national perspective heard on this. And if you really don't like it anymore, if you really don't think it's up to the task, you can denounce it, you can terminate it, like any other contract. And actually, the Budapest Convention is not so restrictive on that. It's a 3 months notice. It's like your rental contract, your lease contract. There's certainly a lot of I would say terms of service agreements online that are more difficult to get out of than the Budapest Convention. So I think a sectoral approach would really be the way forward. Another point to mention is also it's open to all countries in the world. So before anybody starts thinking about a global cybercrime convention, we have already one in force for 43 parties, not just European countries, and everybody can join and adapt it then in the ways I just mentioned. And in a way, I think the sectoral approach, it turns a bit upside down the points made by some of my previous speakers, that it's not that we need the trust before we make the norms, or we make the treaties, or we have norms as an alternative to treaties, but rather through more specific sectoral treaties, more general norms will emerge. And also we shouldn't be too scared of those either. I mean, this is a debate, again, of what rights need to be legally enforceable and what should just be rather soft guiding principles, a debate that's been present in many countries, but I think exceptionally well argued and eloquently codified in Indian constitutional law 50 years ago, 60 years ago. There was a whole discussion about what are fundamental rights and what are directive principles. And Indian law is very clear about that, what is enforceable in court and what is rather just there to guide the political discourse and the exercise of public authority. I think the same we could apply to cyber governance as well. And this leads then actually to my concluding points, that it is actually this mixture, it will be a mixture of such guiding principles and fundamental rights. And I think one great Indian constitutional lawyer, Granville Austin, called this together, the combination of that is the conscience of the Constitution, or the cornerstone of the nation. And I think, and that's my conclusion, so if we want progress in international norm making in the cyber domain, this flexible approach, harnessing a flexible approach as the Budapest Convention, maybe translating that into different sectoral agreements where there is a political agreement, that can constitute progress, and from these iterations will emerge common norms, which hopefully then will give us an idea of what we could call then the conscience of cyberspace, or the cornerstone of cyber governance.
To come in, so
Sure.
I'm going to encourage the
And I'll just make
participants to talk
four
to each
quick
other.
points. First, the European Union is not a good model. You know, in the U.S., one state will honor the warrant of another state because it's a single entity. That's not true for the world. So Europe is not a good model. Second, Budapest is not a good model, and it's probably something Indian audiences would have said too. You know, in the olden days, we could say, you know, the US, Europe, Japan, they all agree, and therefore the rest of the world should follow along. Those days are over. So Budapest is not a good model. Counterterrorism isn't a good model because these are not non-state actors. The principal bad actors in cyberspace are governments. And it pains me so much to say that along with the FSB and the PLA, I now have to include some other three-letter agency that lives close to me, right? So if you're looking at states as the principal actors, a lot of the models we've heard don't fit. And if you're looking at a global system, a lot of the models we heard don't fit. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems we have is there is no trust, there is no agreement, there is state conflict. How can we minimize that? And it has to be an incremental approach.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Some of these points.
Yes, but I actually
Briefly, but
yes, briefly.
yeah.
I actually don't think that you have to exactly bring it to the level of interstate relations. What you're talking about is actually helping the states to deal with the non-state actors internally. So when you talk about counterterrorism legislation, you're not helping one country to fight another country in terrorism legislation. You're helping them to fight terrorists within the country, and I think the same can be done in cyberspace.
Is the EU a good model, or is it not a good model, as you say? Well, I would agree. Geez, I'm really not here to export any of that, and I think that might be really a abortive approach. Might be really this kind of extreme where it gets too much law, too much institutions. But then again, we don't need to look necessarily to the EU or the West in general if we want to look at active international norm making. I think a great other example is if we look further to the southeast from where we're sitting now. If we look at the international treaty making practice of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, they have been concluding with the rest of the world over 200 international agreements and soft law instruments, a whole mixture of it in the last decade. And they have this mixture as well. But when they can't agree on a treaty, they'll have a vision statement, an action plan. So there is this whole range of possibilities, also actively embraced by other international actors.
Not on this particular issue.
Oh, okay. Thank you. No, you put this in a context of you have to get a situation where the U.S., China, and Russia, at a minimum, will have to agree. If you can get that, God bless you, right? But I don't think, and so when they talk about a treaty, I don't want a Kellogg-Briand treaty which banned war in 1928. Hey, that worked so well. Nor do I want something that has only a regional application, because those haven't gone so well either, with the possible exception of the OSCE. These are state actors. We need to find ways to get states to behave responsibly.
I think it's becoming a real debate, and we would want all of you to join this debate. And I think we've heard some of the differences, and I'm glad it's come from the Americans and not from Indians in terms of the critique of the European approach.
But feel free to jump
yeah, sure. Yeah. Just watching the fun. But I think beyond the stated differences in terms of how we go about it, but I thought there was one theme that was common with all the four panelists, which I said, look, I think you've got to be pragmatic. I mean, that you can't do Kellogg-Brown Pact kind of a thing. Look, all war is eliminated, or the first resolution of the first Security Council, first General Assembly, UN, where said, look, atomic energy weapons are bad. So that kind of a thing you can do. I mean, I think a lot of us feel good with that kind of stuff, but that's not happening. And as Alok pointed out as well, that look, there are previous experiences where functional areas it is possible that you can sit down and come up with practical solutions so that you keep moving forward rather than this abstract debate about which either or kind of a debate that is taking place. Patrick, again, I think to talk about, look, there are existing laws, some of that can be translated, and I think that point is well taken. How we go about it, whether capacity building is the only way to do it, or if it's a conditional capacity building, a lot of people are going to say, look, just as conditional aid is no longer acceptable and somebody else is going to give it to you without conditions. So I think we get into all kinds of things. But I think the important thing, again, I thought was the practical step forward. And yours too, I think, mentioned that, look, if your debate was still about defining terrorism, we wouldn't be going anywhere. I mean, I think after all these years in UN, there is no agreement on a definition of terrorism. But we do agree, and states have cooperated, is we all know what a terrorist act is. You go by, as you said, by hijacking, by a range of things that you can begin to deal with those in a practical manner. So that's where we are, and I think we've covered a vast ground. So I want all of you to join in, and I think we've got about 35 minutes, and I'm going to invite you to make comments. I'll take 3 comments at a time and get back to the panelists. So if all of you are short and brief and brilliant, more people will get a chance. I mean, I'll start with Lata Reddy.
Thank you. Jim, I just wanted to tell you that I was delighted to hear you say that what we need is for US, China, and Russia to agree. And I also agree that it's going to be very difficult to achieve that. But if I can just mention that, like you, I think the Budapest Convention won't fly because it was negotiated between a particular group of nations. And when you ask other nations to come on board, they would have certain objections to either the method of negotiation or the fact that they were not in part of the negotiating process. And I know that several countries, including Russia and India, I know of those 2, but I'm sure there are many more, have expressed reservations about joining the Budapest Convention because of problems with national legislation. But my question to you, Jim, is in that case, if we do recognize that anything where the US, China, and Russia are not on the same page is not likely to fly, why is there a tendency to hail the net mundial outcome as unanimous when the fact of the matter is that China and Russia were not on board on net mundial and India expressed reservations on the outcome document? Surely when 3 major players like China, Russia, and India left out, to then trumpet net mundial outcome as a very global consensus would inherently be wrong. I'd like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so you're all... Oh, what's that? Oh, I was just going to say, so you all mentioned the various difficulties in reaching any kind of formal agreement on a number of issues and even achieving sort of agreement on norms and principles. So I'm just wondering if you each could maybe comment on what you think are the low-hanging fruit issues, which issues do you find have much less divergence of opinion? If that's a way that you can sort of, you start with the easy issues and then move on to the harder ones, what are those easy issues and why?
Yes. In the long scale of technological evolution, generally norms are the last mile to cover. This has happened with the aviation. This has happened with the pharma. Norms for civilization came some 50 years after the first aircraft was invented. I believe that, when we have political norms, it inhibits or constrains technological evolution. When we have, cyberspace is such an evolving technology where so much potential is in the offering, is it too premature for us to, impose political norms in this area? Would it constrain the technological evolution? Comments on that?
So, James, you want to start?
I'll start and I'll be quick, or as quick as I can be. First, when I said that those are the U.S., China, and Russia are the obstacles to agreement. Any agreement, and you've heard this repeatedly, this is a theme that now has been widely accepted, you need the new powers involved. And for me, that's not the BRICS. but it would be India, it would be Brazil, Turkey. And so that points you in some ways to the UN General Assembly, where the outcomes of the GGE have been endorsed. It does raise the question of, if you get these regional agreements, how do you globalize them? And we don't have a good mechanism for that, right? But that's, I think, the question. As to Net Mundial, it endorsed some very important things. And the thing that I think I found most important that it endorsed was the applicability of here it comes again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This tension between universal and sovereign. We have to recognize that an environment that does not respect human rights is inherently unstable. And so for me, that was the real benefit of Net Mundial. And of course, India endorses this, but that was where Net Mundial, along with the other things it did, made an exceptionally powerful contribution. On the issue of what are some low-hanging fruit, I think there's a growing consensus that we need to agree on global stability, that you need a stable cyber environment, and the nation should act in a way that produces stability, right? And that's something you hear all countries saying. You also hear, and this is to Patrick's point, that we can extend existing laws, concepts of sovereignty, international agreement into cyberspace. And these are the low-hanging fruits. We've already got some of them. I think we got them in the last GGE to some extent. On the issue, is it premature? It's premature in the sense that it's not going to be easy, right? And so we're not going to see people lining up and agreeing. In fact, it will be very difficult to get agreement. But the one change that I've seen, say, in the last 5 years is that 5 years ago, this was not an issue for the international community. It was not on the international agenda. Now it is, because cyberspace has become so critical to countries' economies and politics and security, and because the problems are so great and problems that the current system cannot deal with adequately. So that's where I think we see. I agree it's premature in the sense that we're not going to find an easy task, but it's not premature in the sense that there's a powerful need.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this issue of low-hanging fruit. I think this is the low-hanging fruit, that, once states accept some degree of self-regulation, and I think it's not a small step to agree that, the international law is applicable to the physical world, also applies to, and along with that goes, a duty to cooperate with each other. And I think that is the part which I see as being the really beneficial thing, because we have in diplomacy something we call a habit of consultation and a habit of cooperation. So as you get into this habit of, consulting each other, talking about these issues, and a habit of cooperating on specific issues, that itself leads to, a more constructive, more cooperative atmosphere, which will then enable more formal drawing up of some of the norms which we might eventually like to see in this space.
You want to start, Joris?
Sure. One quick rebuttal to Dr. Lewis's point, and then some answers to the questions. I think there's one nuance I'd like to add, though, is why I still think counterterrorism and the sectoral approach for counterterrorism treaties is a good idea, is that I don't think it's that easy to say it doesn't apply because here the states are the good guys and governments are the bad guys in cyber governance then. Because if you look at these treaties, how they did very much back in the 70s and 80s, foresee that states could also be bad actors there. That's why you have political offense exceptions, requirements for dual criminality, certain procedures that need to be followed if you want to extradite someone. So it did foresee that states might abuse these provisions as well and try to hedge that as well. So I don't think it's that clear-cut that it is a certain Janus-faced a characteristic of states, and that, or amongst each other, have one, good actions by a state or what it perceives itself to be morally and legally permitted might not be shared by other states. But counterterrorism treaties did, I think, fully endorse and foresee that as well and hedge for it. Just as some answers to the questions, with the low-hanging fruits, I agree with my fellow panelists. I think capacity building is one thing that everybody seems to agree on that's necessary. Maybe not just in the security domain, but also across the board. That you would need cyber lawyers, also maybe some more as you would currently have. global stability, critical infrastructure. I think that there are a few good examples. Another way of, again, creating progress in norm making to get more states to sign up, maybe put it in a more legally binding framework, if you can't agree on a certain specific aspect, will be, again, to take it to a more abstract level. Now, okay, you can't say states cannot conduct espionage anymore, or certain states are not allowed to, let's say, violate privacy because that's an absolute right. And then you're, again, with this clash between rights and what is considered to be an acceptable public policy objective. But these are also debates that have been fought in national domains in India or also elsewhere. And I think a good concept, what I would wish to be implemented or referenced to in the global cyber domain is something in Germany that's called Schranken. It sounds like a horrible disease, but it's actually a quite useful term. It means the limits to the limitations of fundamental rights restrictions. So it acknowledges, on the one hand, no right is absolute. You can restrict human rights if there's a legitimate objective, but there's limits to that again, and they may be yet to be defined, but just an acknowledgement of that, I think, would be useful in the cyber domain.
Want to say something, Patrick?
Yes, very quickly. On the Budapest Convention, and maybe this is the last time we're going to hear this expression today, I don't think anybody was saying that the Budapest Convention is a better model with regard to the rules it has. I think what I was at least trying to say is that it is a model out there, a document that could serve as a basis for the discussion. And I agree with you, there are other actors that come up with different options. That's why I referred to the marketplace of norms at the beginning, because I think that this is the business we're in right now, and it's only the matter of how you actually manage to convince the others that yours are maybe better options. But I think, this should not prevent us from acknowledging good things that are in the Budapest Convention that maybe could provide a basis for discussion among everybody rather than a limited group. And the way in which it was adopted should not definitely stroke down the whole document and what is in there. With regard to low-hanging fruits, well, I think it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you really want to look at what's already out there and to which all the member states have subscribed in the UN context, probably privacy, and this is a kind of counterintuitive, and data protection could be one element, because we already had an agreement at the last UN General Assembly on the protection of privacy in the digital age. So I think maybe that could be a good starting point. But I still believe that you always have to bring it down to specific policy and the policy context in order to explore the options. And I think economy and trade is one of the areas that we could look into.
The premature question, is it premature to regulate things when technology and regulation augment? Europe is for regulation, not...
Yeah, we are more for regulation, it's true. We have a directive that's being currently negotiated, so that's one option. And I think the question was, okay, does it block the innovation? I think we are going to see certain change maybe in the European approach. As you have probably seen, the European Commission has been completely restructured for the next 5 years with the digital single market as one of the objectives. So I don't know to what extent this is going to be used to creating Europe's competitive advantage or a creative innovation, and what ways could potentially emerge from that. But I think it's something to definitely keep an eye on.
Yeah, thanks. Atishay.
Hi, Matishay from the ICRC. Joris, if I could just draw your attention to, you're talking about the existing conventions. If I could draw your attention to the Tallinn Manual, which basically was a manual on international law for cyber warfare. Now, international legal experts came on that, and ICRC was actually one of the observers, but it did also object to some of the things in that manual. What is stopping that manual being internationally recognized, because it was one of the first that defined some sort of international laws around cyber warfare? If you could just throw some light on that. Thanks.
I'm Parminder from an NGO, IT for Change, based in Bangalore in India. Proceeding from what I heard about what concretely can be done going forward, I heard a lot of issues like there is a lack of trust. It's very unlikely we would have treaties very soon. A question I want to put to the panelists is that what is the loss in having an institutional space which is global, legitimate UN, which discusses these issues? You put people together to start discussing, as Lok Prasad ji said, that you get into a habit of consultation, and whether that would not diffuse some tensions and would give you a situation, at least in the future, where you could get something. And in that context to counter an argument that sector-specific approaches are better. And I have a feeling, and I follow this area for a long time, that internet is unique in some ways. There are some internetiness about things, like the globalness, etc., which makes issues which are connected, and therefore that connected perspectives get discussed in a special institutional space. So the question is, what's the harm in giving it as a few $1 million perhaps, but would we not all be better off?
Anyone else? Are we already run out of steam on the... Okay. Yeah, please.
Dr. Tej Aluwalia from ICMR. I look after health systems research for India. My two basic questions from perspective point of view. What is the universal definition of a terrorist? A terrorist for another country may be a patriot for his own country, one. What is the universal definition of one is a terrorist, another is a privacy. How you call as, how you define privacy? Two very basic things as far as what I am hearing these two words since last 2 days, this is the third day. I am still confused. What is privacy and what is terrorist? Thank you.
I think on both, there's never been an agreement. So, in fact, that's part of the story. So that's been going on for... let me come back to the panel. You want to start, yours?
Sure. Just start with terrorism, and that's exactly the point with the sectoral approach, and why I see its merit. That you can't comprehensively, states have tried and they failed to comprehensively define terrorism, but they've managed to identify specific aspects which would qualify as terrorism. And then if you qualify enough aspects, you get some kind of a picture, a mosaic that develops on what that might mean. Maybe with privacy, well, I would defer that to the panel next door on privacy matters, but I would say there you could have a similar approach, saying, okay, you can define maybe what would be the specific infringements of privacy and how you would need to justify those in order to be legal. As to the talent manual, certainly different views on why it hasn't been adopted yet as a global norm on how to apply specific aspects of IHL to cyberspace. If you want my opinion, I think it shows a bit the limits of what some scholars, or Martha Finnemore has called, of grafting, that you have all the existing international law and then you just kind of put cyber on it. You just add that word and then, yeah, that applies too. And that's why I think some cyber-specific norms might be useful to just collect those that you could agree on and put them in a particular cyber governance context, because it might to some extent start to create confusion if you just have the existing laws say, oh yeah, it applies in cyberspace as well, without properly elaborating what that means and how you may want to adapt it. Yeah.
You wanted to come in on this?
Sure. There are many different issues, so I hope I'm not going to miss any of those. I don't think, at least I wasn't making the point that the sectoral-specific approach is better than the general agreement. My approach was coming from the assumption that actually we need to start somewhere. And as Joris has mentioned, even in terms of, in case of terrorism, where states couldn't agree on one definition, they have managed to find a very practical and pragmatic approach of dealing with the issue through working in specific sectors. And that exactly goes to your point about internet being everywhere, so it isn't really different than any other sectors, and isn't it kind of undermining this perspective? I mean, I would exactly use this as our argument to argue that it actually makes no sense to talk separately about the internet as such, because it's actually everywhere. So you should think about the ways of including it in other policy areas, how it can be mainstreamed, rather than kind of separated as this kind of special creature that actually exists somewhere out there and nobody can really identify and put the finger on. So that would be my approach. Now, the definitions of terrorism and privacy, of course, I guess your question goes towards the direction that everybody has different perspectives on that, and basically how can you enhance any cooperation. And I think that those in the room who have followed the exchange between the EU and the US on how do you actually define privacy and what data protection is will know very well that it's a painful process. And what we have done over many years, actually, and that was one of the starting points for the EU and US cooperation, when they've realized that actually they cannot really get much further unless they sit down and try to define what they're actually talking about. When they talk about privacy and data protection regulation, they have created high-level working group on data protection at that point, who was actually trying to come out with different, or let's say, establish what each of the actors meant when they talked about data protection and specific related issues. So they came up with some kind of document which provided the vocabulary that was supposed to guide further negotiations. And I think that this is a good starting point. I mean, we probably will not get agreement right away, but at least if you find specific projects at the outset, you actually work through those problems in a very pragmatic term rather than talk in abstracts.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. So on the Talon manual, let me come back to the Talon manual. I think it was 20 independent experts. There is a growing consensus on how international law applies, on how the laws of armed conflict applies. There are areas still in dispute. That's the task for the 4th GGE, is to see if they can reduce them. But based on the UN Charter, and I think it's Article 5, I don't know if I remember, Sean might know off the top of his head. UN Charter defines acts of aggression, laws of armed conflict, the Hague Convention, others define use of force. Nations are beginning to accept that those apply in cyberspace. And in fact, they've said it at a very general level in the General Assembly. Talon Manual was a little ahead of its time. Perhaps having 20 independents wasn't the way to do it. But it has some interesting stuff. The issue of institutions and how you carry forward this discussion is an important one. It fits into our internet governance discussion. Do you need a new kind of institution to look at security? Is it appropriate for the first committee, for one of the standing UN bodies? Do you need a new body? These are all sort of in play. The mechanism so far has been this UN group of government experts. Most people wonder, should we have a 5th one? Do we set up a new institution? So there's no, again, you've identified an issue that's in play. For an Indian audience, I'd say when I think about terrorism and how you define it and how you get cooperation, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right. I always mangle foreign names, but there's some group called Lashkar-e-Taiba. And, you know, you could say, well, why don't we get cooperation? We can go, hey, they signed the treaty, we'll just go. And we've had this experience too. We're in discussions with Chinese colleagues. They said, we want you to crack down on terrorism. Let's agree cyber terrorism is bad. Stop Falun Gong, right? And Falun Gong for me is a bunch of old ladies doing Tai Chi in the park, right? There are no common definitions, and that's one of the reasons that progress has been so difficult. For privacy, very different cultural concepts. I don't think we can impose a Western model of privacy onto the rest of the world. If I thought we could get away with it, sure, I'd be for it, but it's just not going to work anymore. Similarly with terrorism, there's grave political differences that limit the scope of that. And I'd say, just as a concluding remark, why are we looking at norms and voluntary norms, which is something Ambassador Prasad has brought up? Nations are very cautious in ceding their rights, in ceding their sovereignty in areas that are so important. And that's what cyberspace has become. So every country is moving cautiously. They're thinking carefully about what they're willing to commit to. And that affects the Talon manual. You know, it wasn't developed by states. They're cautious. And I think that's the issue, is voluntary norms that are binding on a voluntary basis by each state that put the cyber issues in the existing framework of state relations is an easier path, given how cautious states will be in reaching agreement in this new area. That might be a good lead-in. Sorry.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. I think one on this issue of definition of terrorism and privacy. I really don't want to get into the privacy part of it because we don't even have a national law on privacy. So if we haven't defined it here, I don't know how we'll define it internationally. But on the terrorism part, I think because the UN has been basically blocked on this issue of the definition, it has in a way sort of got around that by dealing with the consequences of terrorism. And in that it has been remarkably successful. So, you know, you have conventions against hijacking, conventions against, you know, money laundering and all, you know, all the rest of it. So you're dealing with different parts of the problem without, and the underlying principle, of course, is that no objective, political, religious, social, whatever, justifies violence against innocent people. So I think with that in place, then you don't really need to get into this, definitional issue. I want to come back to this question which you raised, that on this habit of consultation. I meant it in this particular area, and I mean, let's face it, we are coming on the background where we've had PRISM on the one side, we've had bot attacks from servers based in the PRC on the other side. This is not an area where there is a great deal of mutual confidence. It's also an area where there is virtually no difference between offense and defense. So it's when we start consulting there, cooperating, sharing information in response to requests, that is what is going to build confidence and hopefully lead to acceptance of norms, in a more formal sense.
To put a question on the table, I mean, which actually James was mentioning, I mean, nobody mentioned espionage. Now, one of the big things that's happened in the last 2 years, and of course, is the scale and scope of the kind of possibilities that exist. And states, if you can do something, you'll do it. I mean, which is what we've seen everyone doing the spying on their own citizens and on the other governments, including heads of government, heads of state. But there's a second part to the story, which is the industrial espionage, which is the Americans are saying, look, we do espionage, everybody does it, so what's the big deal? I mean, I broadly agree with that proposition. But the second part, the Americans say, look, we don't do industrial espionage. That's what the Chinese do. And this is unacceptable. That what the Chinese are doing is actually a fundamental challenge to the logic of intellectual property, the logic of the sanctity of intellectual work that has gone in, and that this is a far more consequential. And I think this has become a lot easier today to do industrial espionage. Of course, a lot of our European friends, the French were famous for it, the Israelis do it on the Americans. I mean, it's not just between enemies, but it's also been between friends. But I think this question, with China emerging as a big force, the whole issue of industrial espionage, and how do we deal with it? I mean, is there any possibilities, the kind of pragmatism we've talked about, can that be applied in any form that can become, and I believe that was the dominant theme at the Sunnyland Summit, with the Americans and the Chinese begin to talk about this. You want to say something?
I'll start, and then I guess the others can pitch in. So espionage is always treated as a privilege of the sovereign. That's why there's really no international law governing it, right? It's something that states do. And, it's difficult to conceive of a world where nations renounce espionage as a tool of statecraft. But I do think we can, in our larger discussions, start to define what is responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And that gives us an opportunity to curtail certain sets of actions. And if you could think of a definition of responsible state behavior that caught both NSA and the PLA, that might be a useful thing to think about. Where the Americans have started, and I have some sympathy for this, is that a good beginning point is to say the commitments you have everywhere else apply in cyberspace. So the commitments you've made internationally to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights apply to cyberspace. The commitments you've made in the WTO to treat and respect the companies of other nations, those apply in cyberspace. And I think that's in particular one where there is a difference between Chinese behavior and American behavior. Nobody forced China to sign up to the WTO. They enjoy the privileges. They also need to respect the requirements and responsibilities.
Well, yeah, just a quick point. Whereas, yes, I agree with Jim that the U.S. has acknowledged that the human rights apply as well in cyberspace. Actually, there has been no real implementation and follow-up on that because European citizens, where their privacy is abused in the United States, still cannot go to the court and claim their rights. So, for me, it's an empty declaration on the part of the U.S. government, and I'm not really sure that this is the way to go. I think it's a good starting point, but then what you have to do next is really discuss how that can be implemented, and that's why I said that could be potentially a good starting point and low-hanging.
Just 2 quick points on that real quick. First, everything the U.S. did was done in partnership with 31 countries. Most of them were European. Right? The fact that Europeans don't know what their intelligence agencies are doing is not my problem. right? The second issue is I have no rights in Europe. When I go to Europe, I'm spied on. I can't make any. So when you ask about reciprocity, it's like, what? Reciprocity? So it's not entirely an honest debate.
Any last questions? I mean, then we're going to just take a couple. Yeah. You want Sean? And I'll come to you after.
Maybe I'm going to rain on the parade a little here of norms, but I have to ask the question of how much do the norms that the diplomats are discussing in these nice meetings actually correspond to what nations are really doing in reality? And can norms be effective so long as they're not actually aligned with the strategic incentives? A couple examples. There's a norm about not co-locating military targets with civilian entities. Yet most governments' military command and control systems are actually coextensive with the civilian telecommunications infrastructure. We have norms about lawful combatants wearing insignia, yet I've just seen a lot of well-armed men in green jackets show up in another country. And most of your human rights treaties actually have exceptions for national security needs. So my question is, we're back to the subjectivity that Jim was mentioning, and where the rubber really hits the road, are the norms matching what countries are doing? Welcome any comments on that.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think my question is slightly different. We have been discussing about the norms in cyberspace for the state actors as well as non-state actors, and we've discussed about espionage. But I think with companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and some of the large platform providers being large entities in themselves, shouldn't there be some discussion about norms for these companies as well, which are applicable along with the rest of the discussion?
If there are no other questions, I just want to put one in, and then we'll take the last comments from the. I think what Sean mentioned, that look, how does all this align with the real world and real politics that constantly happens? There, I think we've seen that in the nuclear case, for example. I mean, I think 18 years after the first nuclear bomb went off, then you had the small treaty called the Partial Test Ban Treaty. That norms, even when they're agreed upon, like 3 countries agreed on it, later everyone joined it, but even seemingly nice sounding like Partial Test Ban Treaty was. But the Chinese said, look, this is about preventing me from doing my thing. I haven't moved to underground. I've still had to do overground. So therefore, what you guys say is a nice, humanitarian agreement. I say, look, this is actually a strategic one to prevent me from doing my nuclear test. So no norm actually has a equal effect on countries. And given the uneven distribution of power in the international system, whichever norm you design, in fact, I mean, in arms control, if you're an arms controller, you designed proposals that benefited you and prevented the other guy from catching up with you. So in a sense, there is that part of the story that given the nature of politics and the absence of a world government, and there is going to be geopolitical contestation, that whatever norms you construct would have differential effect on different states. And that in turn actually generates competition and complicates things. So some of that you can see that in cyberspace today, but is there a way, I don't see a fundamental way of actually solving that problem, but yet you also know that, look, it's only when the big boys get together that when Americans and the Russians decided, look, they have a common way of negotiating arms control, then you saw it acquire some traction, then you bring in others. So there is also the fact that, look, having big boys cooperate, that is it about collective security, multilateral norms, or is it about great power relations? I mean, that tension too has historically existed. So that's my last penny into the debate, and I'm going to take the last set of comments from the 4 speakers, and then we'll wind up. Yeah, you want to start this week? You want to start? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, all that I wanted to say is that I agree with you that behavior is not perfectly aligned with the norms. But, I mean, how is a situation where there are no norms accepted by states any better? I mean, here at least states are self-committing themselves to certain norms. And the logical follow-up to that is that other states can then question that behavior, saying that, that this is a norm that we have accepted. And, so at least it's a beginning, it's a starting point, and it's, gets us off the ground. I said, in this field, in my view, that in itself is a fairly major move forward.
The only remark I'm going to make here is to stay within your imagery of raining on the parade of norms. I think as an international lawyer, constitutional law person, you do manage your expectations a little bit in that sense. And when you talk about norms, I think IR scholars in constructivism like to say norm diffusion, and that's where the imagery comes back, is more like a slow drip than, let's say, napalm in the morning, or something that will really where you should have too high expectations. It's a slow process. It's an iterative process. It might not, of course, dictate behavior in any given situation. There might be other, of course, factors at stake as well. But it does manage expectations, and it does frame the discourse. And I think if you see the lengths at which governments take, the Russian one, the US one, to somehow try to justify what they're doing or deny it and somehow put it in legal terms, I think this tells you something. No one's, to my knowledge, openly saying, yes, this law does not apply to me. I'm free of all of this. And I think the same would apply to norms in cyberspace as well. And then it's also, I think, a bit unfair sometimes to then always focus on the part that's not being complied with. If you say, there's human rights obligations, but there's national security exceptions for that, and that being a sign of lack of rule of law, I would say I think that's an adequate reflection of responsible state behavior. It's a duty of the state to also provide security, and you can't say, oh no, I mean, that would be the other extreme, saying, I'm not conducting any, let's say, surveillance or operations which could prevent a terrorist attack because you hide behind privacy and human rights. It's about the right balance, and I think that's what we're trying to work out in the law. And this is again this mixture between legitimate social objectives, so public policy, global policy objectives, and then certain rights that need to be respected. And it's about the balance of the two that needs to be figured out.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think exactly because of the reasons that you have mentioned, Sean, they're working towards any international agreement on cyber norms will be very difficult or almost impossible. And I think the alternative is really to start thinking about going through those issues on a smaller scale, really working for specific sectors and trying to figure out how that can be actually implemented in very concrete terms rather than talking in abstract terms. And because as we all know, as you mentioned, these principles that we have in norms are not really working. That's why I said the moment you can show that actually you can work on a smaller scale and follow those principles, only then you can think about states realistically thinking that anyone is going to follow their norms that they're working towards in cyberspace. Otherwise, what's the point of the exercise?
Yeah, I guess I won't repeat what I think my colleagues have already said, which is pretty much right. What's the alternative? Norms don't provide a perfect solution, but they mitigate risk, they make the situation more stable. So I guess we can think of examples where norms have changed state behavior. And perhaps I would hold up missile proliferation as one. I would hold up the Helsinki Agreement as another. Norms can change state behavior. And they are perhaps our best tool. It's a shame we're out of time because the others might have used on this. They might be our best tool now for making cyberspace more stable and more secure.
I think that brings us towards the end of the debate, and I'm not going to try and summarize, but I thought one thought that had come to me when the Europeans were talking about norms and the Indians and the Americans were being far more realist in a framework. I mean, I think it was I think a European who said Europe has become postmodern and India, America, and China is still modern and obsessed with power. So I think that divide in some senses continues to exist. But we still, I mean, if Europe didn't exist, we'll have to invent them, because I think they always frame a bookend in terms of how we go forward. But my sense is that what we've, I think, got today, look, you're not going to get a one-shot grand design for producing peace in the cyberspace. I mean, that it's never happened before. It's not going to happen here. That there will be contestation, there will be ups and downs, there will be twists and turns. All that will continue to happen. But at the same time, there is room for doing things practical, pragmatic, and I think we need to keep exploring sectoral, low-hanging fruit, what is possible. Even a simple thing like saying the LOAC, the Law of Armed Conflict, applies to cyber domain. I mean, that itself, where the 5 major powers were involved, I mean, all of them agreed. So I think keep moving where you can, rather than construct extraordinary ambitious designs. I mean, I think our history of the last century was replete with that. I mean, whether it's the League of Nations prohibiting war, or notions of collective security, or sweeping statements of intent are always undermined. So I think it's better to look at functional cooperation, avoiding definitional fundamental questions, but actually seeing that, look, what are the limited steps that we can take. And we also know that, look, even when you have norms or even treaties, enforcing them is not going to be easy. I mean, law of the sea, a lot of been talked about law of the sea. Take South China Sea today. The Chinese say, look, sorry, that doesn't apply. It's our historical claim. So you can have a law which is probably everyone is on board, theoretically, but when it comes to a specific question, the Chinese quite clearly say, look, our claims are historical claims. We're not arguing about law of the sea. It doesn't apply here. So that's why when the rest of Asia says, look, abide by the law of the sea, I mean, Chinese say, sorry, we don't recognize that. Second, I mean, Americans and the Chinese argument on freedom of navigation. The Chinese interpretation of what the law of the sea does, of what is it permitted. For example, Chinese say, we have no problem with freedom of navigation, but the problem is with the freedom of military navigation. The Americans operate too close to my shores. I don't like it, so I'm going to do everything I can to push them out. Now, so the law, by having definitions, does not solve problems. That is, it is finally, you need some sense of accommodation between the major powers and some sense of they working together to produce outcomes that have reasonable application. And then there will always be the holdouts. There will always be what is an American term, rogue states. For example, we continue to see it on terrorism. Everybody signs on to things but don't implement. But at least if we get the major powers on board, some broad understandings, we are in a better place than we are. So let me thank our four panelists, and please join me thanking our four panelists for initiating such a wonderful debate this afternoon.